Welcome back to another double-barreled episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that's been slicing and sliding into your mind palace since 2018. And in this week's episode, I'm turning my discerning eye onto one of those often forgotten 7th-gen action games that, while by no means was an outright failure and managed to garner some dedicated fans, didn't become the next blockbuster franchise either. You know the types of games I mean, the Splatterhouse reboot, Brink, Mad World, or even Haze. Well, okay, maybe not Haze. Anyway, today's subject certainly fits that particular niche, as it was published by the paragon of morally indestructible fiber that is Bethesda Softworks in their earlier days, and was subsequently relegated to the dustbin of history ever since. So grab your custom revolvers, trusty katana, and turn up your favorite rockabilly track as I answer the question, what happened to Wet?
Let's do this.
When taking even a cursory glance at the development of this one, right off the bat it yields some curiosities. The first being that Sierra Games, the publishing arm of Vivendi Universal, was the original publisher, with development being handled by Artificial Mind and Movement, who at that time were best known for making games targeted at younger gamers. Really younger gamers. Ice Age, The Grinch, Chicken Little, Lizzie McGuire, and even That's So Raven, which is That's So A2M. The other thing of note in regards to this Montreal-based studio's output was just that, its sheer output, as they were basically a game-making factory. Just not that game factory. While the amount of work they produced in 2005 and 2006 was impressive, their peak was arguably in 2007, where they released 10 games in the calendar year. And yes, while the majority of those games were for the DS and GBA, they also had a few Wii and PS2 titles in the mix as well, so they were clearly going for the age-old tried and true strategy of quantity and not strictly quality. As you could easily imagine though, after a few very long years of this, the staff at A2M wanted to finally stretch their wings instead of, endlessly shoveling content into the gaping maws of anyone under 12. The solution to this was pitching the concept that would become WET, short for Wetworks, which some of you may know by its military definition, and I know from the coolest comic book series ever. In these very early days, WET, much like its original publisher, was actually a good bit different from what we ultimately wound up getting. To get some further insight into this, I was able to get into contact with a former staff member who wished to remain anonymous for this video, and they were able to share some details from WET's earliest beginnings, when it was just dry. Yeah, here's the quote. Originally, WET, before it was called that, was a project being worked on with a well-known Hollywood director. I'm sorry I can't go into more details about that, but it was a project that featured an acrobatic female protagonist who used dual-wielded weapons. We got quite far into a prototype, but the deal ultimately fell through. Although the concept of the character and the story were not ours to keep, the idea of a female character with an acrobatic moveset and dual pistols were fair game. It was at that point that Ruby Malone was formed. Ooh, Hollywood director? Juicy! Well, I did my own research on this tantalizing tidbit, and I came up with absolutely nothing. It seems this Tinseltown connection occurred and then fell apart before Sierra announced the game publicly, but then Sierra's own involvement ended just as quickly due to the merger between Activision and Blizzard, so we never got any official details as to what was the extent of this Hollywood collaboration. And yeah, I couldn't find a single whiff of which director it could have been, and our best guess, due solely to the parallels between their work and WET, is of course part-time director and full-time foot enthusiast Quentin Tarantino. Again, there's no real evidence to suggest it was Quentin that was being courted to collaborate on WET, but the list of directors that would have been a good fit for such a project in the mid to late 2000s wasn't exactly long. There is one, however, that also seems pretty likely, because while Tarantino's half of 2007's Grindhouse was a tense, dialogue-heavy thriller, it was Robert Rodriguez's pulp-tastic Planet Terror, which Wet owes a lot more to in regards to style and tone. There's further similarities in Rodriguez's Mexico trilogy, which featured copious gunfights, stunt sequences, and various unscrupulous characters. But that also sounds like it could have been a Guy Ritchie film. But regardless, while we don't know exactly which director was at one point involved with Wet's development, it's kind of a moot point, as its inspirations are still very clearly apparent. And honestly, this was more of a footnote when compared to the snags and strangeness that the project would still need to square off with. When Artificial Mind and Movement went back to the drawing board after their foray into Hollywood didn't work, they didn't immediately settle on the blood-soaked neo-western that Wet would eventually become. In fact, my source indicated that the game was at first retooled into more of a sci-fi setting, which isn't the easiest thing in the world to picture, but I guess it was supposed to be something akin to Mace Griffin Bounty Hunter? Which of course marks the first time anyone's ever thought about Mace Griffin Bounty Hunter in quite a while. However, it was the development of their new main character, the aforementioned Ruby Malone, which started to push the team into more of a contemporary direction, and from there, they took inspiration from the likes of Prince of Persia and the then upcoming Stranglehold. God, I gotta do a video on Stranglehold someday. Obviously, with Sierra now no longer in the picture, which again was due to the fact that they were consolidated into Activision Blizzard, and who now weren't interested in the project, Artificial Mind and Movement were on the hunt for a new partner who could fund the rest of development. While it's a little unclear as to exactly how they entered the chat, it was Bethesda who ultimately swooped in to save it. Remember, this was the late 2000s, back when Bethesda would publish all sorts of stuff that doesn't really align with their strategy today. Pirates of the Caribbean, various Star Trek titles, Hunter, The Demon's Forge, and finally, Rogue Warrior, Black Razor. And while you can say a lot about Bethesda's past and current sins, on the subject of their involvement with Wet, my source said, and I quote, "I don't really have any insight into how Bethesda came to be in the picture, but I do know that without them, the game would have never been released." Activision Blizzard publicly declared that they were no longer soaking wet and dropped the game off their slate in the summer of 2008, where it then took a little less than a year before Bethesda revealed they were picking it up at the end of April 2009. One weird wrinkle to that though? It was now releasing that very September, only a few months away, which would make for a very short marketing cycle. Fortunately, Bethesda's Elder Scrolls money came in quite handy, as they were able to snag a rather impressive lineup of Hollywood talent to voice the key characters, including Malcolm McDowell, Alan Cumming, and of course, Faith herself, Eliza Dushku. What that cash infusion couldn't easily solve, though, were technical issues that Artificial Mind and Movement struggled with throughout development, because their 10 years plus of exclusively developing simple handheld games for children didn't exactly prepare them for the complexities of developing an action game for the Xbox 360 and PS3. On this subject, my source pointed out the specific sequence that gave them the most trouble. Creating a game like Wet was a challenge in and of itself. However, we knew we needed to have some palate-cleansing levels now and again to prevent the acrobatic shooting mechanic from becoming stale. The idea to have a car chase sequence came up, but rather than having Ruby drive, she would be leaping from vehicle to vehicle while chasing down an escaping target. For this sequence, we drew inspiration from over-the-top Michael Bay car chase scenes. It was a significant challenge to get that level to where it needed to be. This is something I can personally attest to. As some of you out there may know, specifically from this old video right here, I myself briefly worked on Wet in a QA capacity. Whenever I booted the car chase sequence up, it was littered with debilitating frame rate drops, crashes, and triggers that just wouldn't trigger, while the rest of the game was much cleaner by comparison. Even today, while it's more or less a glorified QTE, it's still a pretty entertaining, over-the-top spectacle to behold. But even with all this hard work and long hours the team were putting in, the appealing aesthetic and violent nature of the game, which was very much the thing of the thing, Wet still had trouble barreling down on it, and Bethesda wouldn't be much help. Wet splashed onto stores on September 15, 2009 in North America and the 18th in Europe, which placed it squarely against big dogs like Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2, Guitar Hero 5, and Halo ODST, which released just a few days later. Batman Arkham Asylum was also still selling like bat-flavored hotcakes, as it had taken the market by storm just a few weeks earlier. Most likely due to that and Wet's very brief marketing campaign, it didn't exactly bust any blocks on release, but according to several reports I was able to dig up, it didn't do terribly either. In an old archived article from CNBC, Wet reportedly sold over 1 million copies, although that's likely because it sold decently for months or even years sitting on store shelves, which to many publishers isn't as good as doing gangbusters in its very first month. Wet never appeared on any NPD top 10 sales charts after its release, so, for example, for it to reach 1 million copies sold, it would have had to have sold, on average, 50,000 copies a month for roughly 20 months, which, given what would happen next, wasn't nearly fast enough. Critically, the game did okay, averaging an aggregate review of 70 on Metacritic for the PS3 and a much nicer score of 69 on the Xbox 360. Websites praised the style, music, high-octane action, at least in the early hours, and comboing combat moves and platforming pageantry, which had all chained together in an impressive dance of death. Criticism was placed on the game's short length, its graphics, the repetitive nature of its gameplay loop, and the paper-thin story and characters. However, despite the tepid response, Wet did ultimately help Artificial Mind and Movement achieve its goals to branch out into non-kid-friendly video game fodder. My source indicated that the deal with Bethesda helped give them an edge to secure the contract to develop Indiana Jones and the Staff of Kings, the PS2 and Wii versions anyway, which you can learn about in this video here. This then led to even more work, such as the graphically impressive PSP port of Dante's Inferno, the Naughty Bear series, and having the unenviable task of porting Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor to the Xbox 360 and PS3, which is a game that certainly existed. But what about Wet? Well, Artificial Mind and Movement absolutely wanted to make it into a franchise, which was made evident in 2011 when listings of a cancelled Wet 2 double feature started appearing on the LinkedIn profiles of several A2M staffers. Fortunately, my source had a few details of this follow-up that never followed up. We were hard at work on a sequel that was going to literally double down on the Grindhouse influence. It was going to be called Wet 2 Double Feature, and it was slated to have 2 shorter story campaigns as opposed to a single lengthier one. The 2 stories were going to focus on an aspect of Ruby's character, challenging her in different ways. Honestly, that sounds pretty dope. 2 separate movies that would have had completely different settings and characters all in one package? I mean, Grindhouse was a pretty big financial failure in theaters due to its lengthy overall runtime, but I'd imagine the concept would work far better as a game. Bethesda was even asked about this listing for Wet 2 by Engadget.com, but bluntly replied with, "We are not publishing Wet 2. Which, when you get down to brass tacks, means that the first game failed whatever hard-to-achieve metric the publisher had in mind. My source seemed to concur on this. As I mentioned before, we were working on a sequel and even had a playable prototype for it. In that demo, we were able to push Ruby's abilities much further. Sadly, the lukewarm reception of the first game did not boast any real interest to pursue the full development of a follow-up title, and the project was ultimately cancelled. Of course, things are very different nowadays. Artificial Mind and Movement changed their name back to its original moniker when they first opened in 1997, Behavior Interactive, and went on to make the asymmetrical horror juggernaut that is Dead by Daylight, which is a far cry from the landfills of forgettable licensed dreck they pumped out in the mid-2000s. But it still begs the question, who currently owns the Wet IP? Bethesda? Behavior? Like, there's Naughty Bear Cosmetics in Dead by Daylight, and that was originally published by 505, a completely different company, so why not bring Ruby Malone back one last time, even if it's just to run around and repair generators, over and over and over again.
Door. Open, damn it! I don't have time for this shit!
Thanks goes out to the source who took the time to speak to me regarding today's subject. And if you out there know of any other gaudy and or gritty games with interesting or, really messed up development stories, let me know in the comments below or head on over to the Grindhouse that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!